Okay, here's the exciting part 6 for the heart, page 673. We're continuing to work on this diagram of action potential as well as the tension created by the musculature. So you might recall, let me get in a position here where I'm not causing glare. We have this action potential, we have this tension diagram, and then I've added to this in my own different coloring a sodium permeability, a calcium permeability. This is the fast, the slow channel, and then we have repolarization from the potassium permeability coming from the other side. So I drew this diagram before for a different action potential, and here we're looking at an action potential that's going to produce more than a minus 70 resting potential. We're going to create an action potential that causes a minus 90. Okay, so outside is here, inside is here. It all begins with this pump right here that pumps the sodium out. The sodium channel is closed, so the sodium remains outside. It pumps the potassium in. The potassium channel is closed but leaky, which means most of the potassium remains inside. Some of it leaks through to contribute to the positive charge out here. We're also getting, in this case, a different pump. I had to draw it in here between the phospholipids. And what we have here is we have a calcium pump, also driven by ATP. It pumps calcium out, it pumps potassium in, and so we have much more potassium now than we did before inside. And we have, again, a leaky situation where some of it's getting out and contributing to the positive charge. This is a double positive ion here, calcium plus 2. So we've really got a large positive charge. Now we're at minus 90, not just minus 70. So it's a much more, how shall I say, snappy situation going on here. Okay, so the first, when we get an action potential, the first thing to open up here is the sodium channel. The sodium channel is in a very highly charged positive area. It is itself a charged particle, a positive particle, so it's going to move down the diffusion gradient with great force by two reasons. One is it's moving from positive to negative, and so it's attracted to the negative, so that's the electrical aspect of its movement, and then also it's moving down its diffusion gradient. And so we have the sodium moving in at a very rapid speed, and you can see here the result. We have a nearly asymptotic curve right here for depolarization. We're going from minus 90 all the way up here past the 0 mark into positive territory. Okay, and then the sodium channels snap shut. Okay, and as soon as they snap shut, we're getting further depolarization events coming from the calcium. But the calcium is slow because there's already positive charge inside, so it's not propelled by that electrical gradient. Instead, it's only propelled by its own diffusion gradient, and it's flowing down what we call the slow channel. Okay, and it's maintaining this plateau right here. And so that means that we're going to have a period of contraction. And in that period of contraction, we have an event, a very organized event in the heart, which is going to pump a lot of stroke volume out of the ventricles. Okay? So that's the intention of this plateau. So we have an additional, how shall I say, an additional ion in the mix. When we get to this portion right here, we begin to get repolarization events occurring, and that's where finally the potassium channel opens up. We get the full positive going back outside again. We get these pumps to rectify the original situation, and sodium is out, potassium comes back in, calcium goes out, potassium comes back in. That takes a little bit of time through this, but the tension has been created and is eventually going to decline when this all sort of wanes out there, and it's no longer part of the picture. Okay, so we have this entire event then sort of calculated for us, and it's a very energetic event. It's an event that requires calcium. In 2016, there was research done to discover that vitamin D is not only needed for the crossing of calcium at the gut level to be taken up from our food as a nutrient, but also it turns out that vitamin D is required to make the heart work better. And there was a discovery with congestive heart failure patients that people who were in serious conditions with congestive heart failure could get an increase in cardiac output of something like 18% in one study that I was reading by just the administration of a normal dosage of vitamin D, active vitamin D. So vitamin D is playing a big role. If you're a heart patient, you might not be getting outside and getting sunshine on your skin, and so a supplement might be required under those conditions to add to the situation. So calcium is now this something in your mind that should be extremely important, because we saw it as the item that initiated twitch in the skeletal muscle. It initiates the movement of neurotransmitter into the synapse in the nervous system. So here we have a lot of functions for calcium. Moving on, we're going to be considering a completely different type of action potential here now. The action potential we were just witnessing is the action potential involving just the cells, actually most of the cells actually of the heart, the contractile cells. These cells here, this is the pacemaker action potential. These are non-contractile cells. These are actually, how shall I say, evolved to be electrical cells of the heart to stimulate the heart. So let's come back to this diagram for a moment and imagine that if we were not creating a potential by having a leaky potassium channel, what if this was a very tight channel? It did not leak. And that's actually what we're going to be using in this scenario. Let's imagine that we're tightening the potassium channel to the point where we're getting less polar. Less polar means moving towards zero in this situation. So let's consider the situation here. We're at minus 60. Threshold is right about here, that we have to cross threshold in order to get an action potential. An all or nothing event is something that requires passing through threshold. Okay, and in this situation, what's happening is we're getting declining potassium permeability. Less and less and less potassium is crossing over, leaking out, and contributing to the outside of the membrane. So where things are becoming less and less and less polar. They're still a little bit polar, but less. But we're able to cross the threshold. Once we cross the threshold, then we'll get another heartbeat. We'll get another action potential. Okay? It'll be created, in this case, by a combination of sodium, mostly actually potassium, or rather calcium is playing the role here. So this is quite calcium driven, shall we say. So at any rate, I want you to sort of understand that this is an entirely different type of permeability situation, an entirely different type of action potential, and it's unique to the autorhythmic cells. So the autorhythmic cells, you could say, function sort of on their own plan, shall we say. Okay? And they're modified. We'll have to take a look now next at how they're modified by the sympathetic and parasympathetic system, and we'll look at that in the next diagram.